when I entered the picture with Lucas and Spielberg and Verhoeven, it felt like the Wild West because nobody knew what they were doing. They had forgotten the past. And so we were forging new territory, but it was territory that we knew because it had already been forged. Then it kind of felt like being pioneers, and there was nobody looking over our shoulders telling us what to do. And so creatively, we had fun. I'm Phil Tippett, and I've worn a great many hats during my career. I've been a model maker, a sculptor, a stop-motion animator, visual effects supervisor, and director. I got my start working on the first Star Wars trilogy, RoboCop, Jurassic Park, Starship Troopers. I had to attend college in the United States because I needed to avoid the draft for the Vietnam War, and otherwise I would have launched straight into trying to work professionally in Hollywood. But the education that I received was the result of not having enough money to go to film school, which is what I wanted to do. So I was able to go to art school, which ended up being the best thing that could have happened to me. To get a substantial art historical education and to be introduced to at that time, the cutting edge of what was going on in the art scene in New York and Los Angeles, which was conceptual art. And so my mentors were artists like Bastian Otter and Michael Asher that were very pivotal in changing my thinking about how to approach material. I had always been interested in the magic of cinema from the time I was 5 years old. I saw the 1933 Cooper Schoensack production of King Kong on television when I was 5. And then a few years later, I talked my parents into taking me to see the Seventh Voyage of Sinbad by Ray Harryhausen. And at that point in time, it was like lightning struck my brain. And I didn't know what I was seeing. To me, as a child, it was like magic. And I've never lost that connection with that feeling of wanting to see magical things. And so from there on, I studied cinema, and then everything just kind of fell into place. Ray Harryhausen actually wasn't one of my mentors. I had met him very early on. When I was growing up and trying to find material about the processes that I didn't understand, the only periodical that existed was a magazine called Famous Monsters of Filmland that was edited by Forrest J. Ackerman. And Forrest Ackerman had a museum that had a great amount of movie memorabilia, artifacts, and a lot of the King Kong models and puppets. And Forrest was a friend of Ray Bradbury and Ray Harryhausen. So whenever Ray Harryhausen was in town, Forrest would invite us to his house, and we would meet him. So I met him when I was like 16 years old. And then eventually I ended up shooting a movie called Dragon Slayer on the Pinewood lot at the same time that he was doing Clash of the Titans. So that was his last movie and one of my very early movies. And so that was a good crossover. So we would go out to the pub and talk. And he had a great sense of humor. Ray liked to laugh a lot. So, it was always a good time to hang out with him. John Landis and other filmmakers were huge fans of his. They got him to play a doctor.
I think Ray Harryhausen is really the grandfather of stop frame animation.
The father of all we do today in the business of science fiction, fantasy, and adventure.
Very flattering. Ray's the only technician, really, who is an auteur.
Stop motion was the only way that one could realize doing fantastic characters that were outside of the human realm, that were outside of being a person in a makeup, or a Dracula, or a Frankenstein, or something like that. That if you wanted to have a dragon, or a cyclops, or something unimaginable that couldn't be fit into a human form, stop motion was really one of the only ways that you could produce that kind of effect. And eventually, technology developed to the state where throughout the history of stop motion animators had tried to make the characters be more believable by adding motion blur. And that was a very difficult process to do when you're doing traditional stop motion work. But when we started working on the Star Wars movies, it became very clear immediately that using the motion control technology that they were using, the robot movers that they used to fly the spaceships, through the scenes, that if you could figure out a way of accommodating that to a stop motion puppet, then you could integrate motion blur into the characters. And as the kind of the Ray Harryhausen B movies of the 50s and 60s became the A movies of like the Star Wars and Close Encounters and that kind of thing, it was an imperative thing to do, was to try and make the imaginary characters feel cinematically more blended into the scene. And that was by the introduction of motion blur. I have been working on a series of short films that will be combined into a feature-length movie that uses almost exclusively stop-motion animation, because that's what I like to do. I actually do not work on a computer at all, ever. I don't like to sit down, and I am dyslexic, so I don't like to type. And so I have found a form in this project that I've come up with called Mad God, that I've been working on for the last 30 years, that is not commercial at all. So I could not get money from a studio. There's no way that I could pitch this idea to anybody that has money that would understand it and think that they would get their money back. So it's more of a test of my own will, or some kind of strange passion to create this thing that I see and take it to its fulfillment and then see what happens. So it's purely a creative act. I'm really not remorseful about the change from photographic to computer graphic effects at all. It was a very difficult right-hand change for me to make that adjustment, but it was also that or die. So there was really no other alternative. And the way it worked out was that I never really actually had to totally adjust to the computer myself, because I knew stuff that was more imperative to the filmmaking process that had nothing to do with computers, about how you organize things in pre-production and work with the directors and the writers and the producers and getting things ready to shoot, and then going out and shooting all of that stuff. Then you bring it back, and once the editors have cut the scenes together, then you work with the animators, whether it's stop motion or computer graphics. But the most important thing is to get all that stuff done right in the first place. And most people at that point in time, like around Jurassic Park time, that worked on computers did not have that experience, and I did. And so that kind of elevated me into another niche.
It's a dinosaur.
There's no doubt our attractions will drive kids out of their minds.
Grandpa! We're gonna make a fortune with this place.
Yeah, the format of a film makes all the difference in the world. It's like any time you change anything in terms of format. If you're drawing, it's different than working with pencil. It's different than working with charcoal. If you're working with charcoal, it's different than painting. If you have a 1:8:5 aspect ratio, it means something. If you have a 2:3:5 aspect ratio, it means something. So David Lean shooting Lawrence of Arabia with a lot of horizons to give the sense of scope and spectacle chose the 2:3:5 because of the horizons. And on Jurassic Park, very early on, we determined that 1:8:5 was the proper aspect ratio to frame dinosaurs because of how they looked. And so you make your aesthetic decisions about the frame, based on what the dramatic intention is. I have never been involved with a project where they changed formats midstream. I have been involved with projects where the director insisted on shooting 2:3:5, and then halfway through the project said, "Why are we shooting this in 2:3:5? We should have shot this in 1:8:5." And it was like, well, that was your decision.
We're going to open next year, that is if the lawyers don't kill me first.
What species is it?
It's a velociraptor.
I have been extremely lucky to have lived in a period that was in the post failing of Hollywood, where when television came in, Hollywood kind of began to disintegrate, and the studios kind of fell apart, and their visual effects departments were disbanded. And then a new generation came up that were the George Lucases and the Steven Spielbergs that revitalized everything. And so they kind of reinvented what had been forgotten, kind of like they understood how to remake the pyramids. Nobody else knew how to make pyramids anymore. And so they were very accepting of using all of the traditional techniques that had been developed since the beginning of cinema. Matte painting, stop motion animation, optical printing, whatever. And so we were very lucky to be. I was of the generation, maybe like 10 years just behind, George and Steven, that were able to. Essentially, they were the 800-pound gorillas that were able to launch these projects, and they found the people that were behind them that were interested in these kinds of effects, and so they hired us. And there was very few of us, that did this kind of work, and we were all self-trained from childhood, and never went to school, and just learned on our own. And so did they. And they didn't go to film school, or George went to film school. I don't think Steven did, but they learned through experience, and they appreciated people that learned through experience and wanted to bring something new to cinema. And so a number of us were very lucky to be part of that period. Special favorite movies really don't exist for me. I think if you talk to other filmmakers, what you'll find is that they're happy to have worked on successful movies, and they're like, indifferent to have worked on movies that aren't so good. But what the common denominator to all of my professional friends is the camaraderie of the people that are making a film. So you can be working on a great film with a horrible crew, and you can be working on a terrible film with a great crew. And that's what you remember, is that when you see the film projected, it starts and ends really quickly. But what it takes to actually do that is months and months and months and months and months and months of work. And so that's your experience. The final movie is not your experience. Your experience is being in the moment with these people, and whether you like them or not. And that's what you remember, is the parts that you like, and then you forget the parts you don't. I rarely look back. I will go to preview screenings or cast and crew screenings of movies that I've worked on. And so most of the movies that I've worked on, I've seen once, or once my children grew up and could watch some of them twice. And that's pretty much it. You know, I don't look back, I look forward. It's kind of interesting what has happened over the last 10 years gradually, is that Hollywood as a resource for making theatrical features has dried up in California, because all of the work has been outsourced to tax-advantaged nations, you know, mostly in the UK. So there's like little or no work in Hollywood at all. And what has kind of miraculously happened is, as the Hollywood box office is slowly taking a dive, immersive entertainment worldwide is on a vertical rise. And so we're working almost exclusively now with the Chinese, and doing Chinese features, working with a company called Wanda, doing immersive entertainment. And that's an interesting kind of sociological phenomenon that's going on that I never expected to see, was the changeover as audiences always switch depending upon whatever technology is available. And there are so many technological choices available to people that their games are in many ways, video games, or whatever you call it, interactive games, are in many ways more popular than cinema. Things that immediately engage the senses. It's almost as though, I mean, from my perspective, cinema in a way is like symphonic music at the end of the 19th century. It was done. It was over. You know, was that the end of any kind of classical music? No, no, not at all. No, there's like really great composers that continue to work, but that particular form was spent. You know, there was nothing more to say after Beethoven and Mahler and Wagner. You know, there was just, until you found a new voice in Philip Glass or Steve Reich, and not to mention the Russian composers, who were also really good. But so that you kind of wait for these changes to occur, and keep your fingers on the pulse of the culture, of what's going on. And as things change, you accommodate the change and adapt for survival. And you find value in that. And so that's kind of what has happened with this move for me from cinema to immersive rides, is it's opened up a whole new door of creativity. And the immersive entertainment is very kind of similar in a totally different way, where narrative, story is not as important as it is in theatrical cinema, but it changes. It's not about narrative anymore. It's more like dance or ballet or choreography. It's much more abstract, and in that way, much more freeing creatively to be able to move around, because you're not bound to a 3-act structure that has to do this on this page and has to do that on that page and must do this on this page and must resolve itself in an end. It's much more open-ended, and so we're currently working on some immersive entertainment for a company called Wanda, which is a huge company in China, and we're working on a immersive entertainment piece called The Dark Ride that is about the Monkey King. And the Monkey King is a 4,000-year-old myth in China. And that's like fascinating. I don't know anything about the Monkey King, you know, and so, you know, I get to like explore and live in this world that I really know nothing about and have fun just imagining and creating what that world could be.
You did a good thing, Manuel. You know you did a good thing.
The immersive entertainment that I'm involved with is not VR related. It's very much like an old-fashioned roller coaster ride, and they exist in a number of different formats. Some are like huge domed screens that are like 360-degree dome screens that are like hundreds of feet across, and you sit in seats that have 6 axes of movements, and they're characterized, a lot of them are characterized as fly rides. So you're flying through an environment that is maybe like picture postcard versions of a particular province in China that they want to extol the virtues of. Or on the Monkey King project, it's more of a, they call it a dark ride experience, where you are actually moving on like a robotic arm through a live set, like a live action set in an environment where you can have, mechanical creatures popping out of you or whatever, and then you eventually land on a domed screen that has media on it. And so, you know, we are creating the media and figuring out all the mechanics of how you get from A to B. And so it's, yeah, so you're moving along, and all of a sudden, you know, your world is, the periphery of your vision is like consumed with a scene of the Monkey King releasing all the stables of the horses from heaven, you know, to disrupt the world of the gods above. You know, everything, all the media we're doing is totally digital now, for a number of different reasons. Some of the fly rides that we have executed were over iconic landscapes in particular provinces that Wanda wanted to extol the virtues of, or a particular town. And that gets technically complicated in terms of how you set it up. And it's a given from the beginning that you cannot shoot from a helicopter, because you cannot adjust the speeds later on. You have to know exactly what you're doing. The weather in China is terrible, and you can't predict it. So what we do is very elaborate. We'll take Google Maps, and we'll figure out the areas that we're interested in. And like you would do for a theatrical feature, you'll figure out the dance floor of the path of what you want, and the order, and the quality of time over the piece will go from dawn to dusk. So over the course of the thing, you know, the lighting will change. And you use every dramatic effect that you can conceptually at the beginning to make sure that the audience is engaged, to make sure that there's always an objective that they're tracking, even though they may not know it until they've passed it. But there's an intention behind every camera setup that is intended to be invisible. There's no cuts, so you have to engineer into it like wipes through, you know, foliage or a piece of architecture or whatever, and you know, therein, you know, create like a continuity of experience. And what's engaging for my studio at this point in time, when you're working on theatrical feature films, you're working on a very tiny part of something bigger. We used to work in a much larger scope and do an entire movie, but since the entertainment industry has outsourced most of the work globally, the work is being done everywhere by a bunch of people. So in terms of being creative, there's no ownership to the process. But with these things, we're producing everything. You know, the Wanda leaves us alone, essentially. They manage us, you know, financially, but we write the scripts. You know, we voice cast the characters, we create the score and the sound effects, and do all the finishing work, you know, ourselves, you know, the mixing and the color correction. And that's, as a filmmaker, that's really rewarding. It's just like, it almost doesn't matter what you're doing in some ways, but just to be able to take something full circle and say, you know, we did that is rewarding.